I presume that you had some things to think about yesterday, about open centers, about the not-self, about the nature of what it is to be you. One of the things that I tried to get across was how the mind itself is the greatest enemy in all of this. It's your mind that gets in the way. It's your mind that rides whatever the not-self is and holds on to that not-self and keeps on reaffirming it for you on the mental plane. Over the years, when I first started, I just assumed that if you told people what their strategy was, that they would just go out and do it. Fool that I was. People didn't just do that. And I honestly, because I'm not in your situation, I was awakened. I don't know what it's like to go through a deconditioning process. I've only been able to witness it in those people, students of mine who I've had for as much as 10 years, who I've been able to see go through their full 7-year process. So I see what kind of dilemma they've had to deal with, what it is to go through a deconditioning process. And in being able to watch their process and the ongoing teaching program that I've been involved with over all of these years, it's been evident to me that unless there's some way of involving the mind in this process, that it's very, very difficult to decondition yourself. And the mind, it's interesting. The mind is interested in anything that's interesting. I mean, this is the thing about the mind. It loves anything that's interesting. That is interesting to you, obviously. And the mind is at its very best when it's doing research. And this is the key to being able to find an ally for yourself in your process. Let me describe it to you in another way. We're going to look today. By the way, are there any reflectors in the room? No? Okay. That gives me more time for the rest of you. Okay. Knowledge and the knowledge of awakening is very different depending on type. And it's very different depending on type according to the way in which the mind works in each type. Each type has its own mental process. So, for example, I've talked a lot about the generator. It's 70% of humanity. Generators, because they're here to make decisions in response, have the capacity of being transformed. But for their mind, the business is know yourself. Now think about what it is to be a generator. That is, the moment that you're looking at a generator, what you're looking at is that through the sacral center, as you saw yesterday, the sacral center generates life. It generates all forms of life. I mean, that's its job. That's what it does. And the fact that it is the thing that generates the pattern of life itself, literally because of that, only generators are here to know themselves. Only generators are here to know themselves. You know, the temple at Delphi, originally it said generators only. You know? Know thyself. And underneath there was this plaque. It said generators only, and some angry manifestor just erased it. But the reality is that know thyself is only for generators. And what I mean by that is that, remember, I'm speaking in the context today of the mind. Of the mind. That's all I'm talking about. What I'm talking about today is what is interesting to the generator mind. And what is interesting to the generator mind is know thyself. It's the most interesting thing for the generator mind. It is not the most interesting thing for the manifestor mind, or the projector mind, or the reflector mind. In other words, only generators are here to know themselves. And only generators are designed to know themselves and know themselves easily. Easily. Okay, so these are the things that attract the mind. Now look, when you're looking at a manifestor, manifestors are not here to know themselves. They're here to know your impact. They're not here to know themselves at all. As a matter of fact, it's very hard to find a manifestor that's actually interested in themselves, because the moment they try to think about themselves, they get deeply confused. You know? Because manifestors aren't here to know themselves. That's generator conditioning. Remember, we all live in a generator conditioned world. And it's the generator that's designed to know themselves, so manifestors and projectors and reflectors end up becoming super try to know themselves. And it doesn't work. I was never interested in myself. I mean, as a manifestor, the last thing I was interested in was knowing about myself. Didn't know my astrological sign until I was 33. You know, I was not somebody that was interested in who am I. It's not natural for a manifestor. So one of the things to understand is that the minds of different types, they work differently. They work differently. If you're a projector, you're not here to know your impact. You're not here to know yourself. You're here to know the other. When you say to a projector, you're going to find out about yourself, it's not interesting to the projector mind. It's secondary. What's interesting to the projector mind is, how does everybody else work? Because they're the ones that I'm here to manage. They're the ones that I'm here to guide. How do the others work? So projectors don't come into the world saying, who am I? They're interested in, how do they work? How does that other one work? How do they function? What's their thing? Projectors come into the world to recognize and be recognized. And everything about their life is about the capacity to be able to recognize the other, the potential in the other, the capacity in the other. And so they're not interested in themselves. And remember, when I say that, I'm talking about the mind. I'm only talking about the way the mind works. The projector mind wants to understand the other. The generator mind wants to understand itself. The manifestor mind wants to understand its impact. And when you come to the reflector, they're here to know their world. That is, they're not here specifically to know the other, but they're here to know their milieu, to understand their environment. So we have 4 different ways that the mind operates. Each type has its own deep mental theme. Now remember that the generators, because they're 70% of humanity, the generators dominate in terms of the way in which the rest of us are conditioned. So manifestors are conditioned away from knowing their impact to being concerned about themselves. That projectors are conditioned away from knowing the other to be concerned about themselves. You know, the reflectors are turned away from understanding their environment, and it all comes back on themselves. And you have to see that if you're a non-sacral being, that it is a torment to be focused on who you are, and it's totally unproductive. And it does nothing to seduce your mind. See, when a manifestor or a projector or a reflector comes to this kind of knowledge, their basic interest is not knowing themselves, and therefore it's very difficult for them to know themselves. It is. It's very confusing. You know, the moment they start focusing on only who they are, if you'll notice with projectors, most of the time projectors will be looking at everybody else's chart other than their own. And it's not because they're avoiding looking at themselves. Their mind isn't interested in that. It's interested in the other. The other means everything to them in terms of the way in which their mind works. And everything about being able to wake up, that is to be able to follow your strategy, to be able to go through that process, is that you can only do that if your mind is going along with you. And the way to get your mind to go, for me, manifestors are like a beautiful horse. Once horses ruled the world. I even lived in a little village in Germany that had a Pferdkirche, that is a horse church, where twice a year the horses would actually be brought into the church. No people, there's no pews in there. The horses would be brought into the church and blessed. Horses ruled the world. The world was conquered on the back of horses. Horses did all the work. There were 2 million horses in New York City at the turn of the century. I mean, the United Nations had a stable of something like 40 or 50,000 horses. Horses ruled the world. Then all of a sudden, it was over. And now, if you're a beautiful horse, you're either something that people bet on at the racetrack, or little girls ride at riding schools. And manifestors once ruled the world. They're the only type that can initiate. They're the only type that doesn't have to wait for somebody else. They're not here to respond. They're not here to wait out any cycle. They're simply here to act. And because they were able to act, they were able to establish basically the propaganda of what life would be. Every other type suffers from the fact that manifestors ruled. They suffer from the fact, particularly generators, because generators cannot do what manifestors do. They cannot initiate. It's how manifestors enslave them. Be like me, the manifestor would say to the generator. And the generator would only suffer frustration and never be able to challenge the manifestor. So manifestors ruled. Well, we went from a 7-centered to a 9-centered being at the close of the 18th century. Basically what happened is that we had a change in the way the hierarchy works. That is, the hierarchy of the real hierarchy. If you look in the 17th gate, in the 5th line, you'll see a line that says, "No man, no woman is an island." There is no end to hierarchies, and there is no end to hierarchies. And we have had all kinds of hierarchies on this planet, whether it's been financial hierarchies, blood hierarchies, caste hierarchies, you name it. Humanity has always dealt with hierarchies. The fact is that there is a basic hierarchy, and this is not about better or worse. It's just a hierarchy. Manifestors lost their place. On the ascendancy are projectors. Projectors are here literally to guide. Projectors, because they're neither manifestors nor generators, have the potential to be wise in the way of manifesting and generating. That ultimately it's their role to guide and to guide humanity well. Generators are here to be transformed from slaves to builders. It's so important to understand that the relationship between the projector and the generator is the most special relationship we have. That is, that the moment that the projector asks the generator, or the moment that the generator invites the projector, that relationship is a relationship that is ultimately always mutually beneficial. That is, the ability to be able to guide the energy type. The whole thing about a generator is that the moment that a generator is entering into work that is correct, and remember the generators are here to work, then what can be done we can't even compare to what we see today in the world. In other words, that, generators operating correctly are truly the great builders, and what they'll build, we cannot know. Reflectors are here to provide justice. That is, reflectors are quite literally that. They're the mirror of their communities. Through a reflector, you can see the environment, the human environment that they participate in. And manifestors are out to pasture. That's me. I'm an old horse, and I'm looking for the green pastures, and I can just sort of wander around and wag my tail and, have a nice time. But the reality is that is true for manifestors. It's not their time. And the fact that it's not their time, and it's not been their time for centuries, means that they meet even more resistance if they're not acting correctly. It's something very unusual about the manifestors, that manifestor strategies are not natural. A generator's response is absolutely natural. It's the way the motor works. It's the way life works. And the strategy for a projector and reflector are precisely in accordance to their nature, but not the strategies of a manifestor. The strategies of a manifestor are the strategies for the manifestor of our time. That is, the manifestor since this transformation. Manifestors were never taught to ask permission. Manifestors were never told to inform. It is not natural for a manifestor to do either. It is not. It is not. And in the past, when they were at the top of the hierarchy, it didn't matter. As a matter of fact, it was worshipped and praised and idolized and followed. And of course, that era is long over. It's long over. So manifestors have a strategy that in fact is not natural. But it is a strategy that allows them to wander in those pastures at peace. And in that to be able to fulfill their potential as manifestors. No type is more repressed. I mean, I've been doing this work a very long time. You know, no type is more repressed than manifestors. None. None. When I sit in a room of manifestors, it's like being in a room with beached whales. You know? And I mean, for me as a manifestor, it is really a shock, you know, to see how little power is there. It's so deeply repressed. And the moment that there was a transition in the hierarchy, the manifestor became the uh-oh of every mother. You know, suddenly the manifestor was something to be feared from the start. Suddenly the manifestor was something to be controlled from the start. And so this is what all manifestors go through. All manifestors, from the moment they come into the world, are controlled. They're controlled by the forces around them. Remember, this is an angry type. It's an angry type. You want to see repressed anger, meet any manifestor. And you will see deeply repressed anger. They've been controlled. It's not natural for them to be controlled. They want to be controlled. They're not here to be controlled. And yet their time is over. You know, so this is one of the real confrontations that is there for the manifestor. And the key is for the manifestor to be able to recoup its sense of worth and to be able to discover its continued value to itself and to its community. This requires a great deal of cooperation from parents. Because you see, manifestors, because it is unnatural for them to look to the other for any kind of permission in any way, that only with early training is that something that can be developed successfully. I was very lucky. I had a mother who was, you know, very much into being correct and polite and all of that stuff. And that's the way I was trained. I had a very heavy-handed father, and it was just necessary for me to ask permission. The fact that I had an open emotional system meant that, yeah, I would play the game. You know, I would avoid the confrontation. So I would ask permission, and then I would go out and do whatever the hell I wanted. But, you know, I did my best to play the game, and I learned how to do that. If you don't learn how to do that as a manifestor when you're young, it is very, very, very difficult to ever get to a place as a conditioned manifestor where you can, without pain, inform somebody. You know, manifestors have a really hard time with all of that. You know, and manifestors can be very, very deeply, deeply conditioned beings. And then if you have a deeply conditioned manifestor, you have somebody whose energy is used by everybody else. You have somebody that makes a really good super slave. You know, and you keep them a super slave. You burn them out. You know, you keep them exhausted. You know, and in that way you keep them weak, and in that way they no longer can claim their power. And every other type, when it meets a manifestor, its aura contracts. It just contracts. It's like, whoa, wait a second. It's the aura that says that. Whoa, you can't trust this. You know, it's built in. So when you have a manifestor child and you teach that manifestor child manners, basically what you're doing for that child is that you're giving them the opportunity to have a sense that their power won't be restricted. That's the irony. You know, the child is told, ask permission. So the child says, is it okay if I go out now? Rather than just going out. Because if they just go out, they get punished. They get punished. You know, so if they learn to ask, and I go out now, and if the parents don't unreasonably deny them, and that's the point, you know, not to unreasonably deny them. If you have a manifestor child and you're unaware, you're going to have enormous control mechanisms at work. You know, it's not easy for you to simply say, yeah, okay, go out. You know, not easy to give permission without conditions. You can go out, but, you know, make sure that, you know, you're here, but you're back in an hour and a half and blah, 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 and all of this stuff. Manifestors are controlled. And when the young manifestor recognizes that the only way that they have the freedom to even go out is to ask, they learn to ask. And if they're not unreasonably denied, they learn not to resent having to ask. They learn to see that it's just the rules of the road and something else. When a manifestor asks permission, the other side, their aura, relaxes. It just relaxes. It's like they're being good, you know. Good manifestor, you know. We can trust you, you know. You're asking permission. You need us, you know. You respect us. You're going to pay attention to us. You're going to do what we tell you to do. Aren't you being a terrific manifestor? You know, there's this whole game that's played in all of that. It's for the manifestor to eliminate resistance. Everything about us, everything about life is that we're moving in space and we're all meeting resistance all the time. If you're a manifestor and you do not inform, you're only going to meet resistance. Only. Only. And the manifestor, because the manifestor doesn't look at itself, doesn't realize something. It doesn't realize that its actions carry an impact. It doesn't even recognize that. It's not paying attention because it's angry. And it's not paying attention because it feels control, and all it wants to do is be out of that control. Break free of it.